to another instalment of Share a Story with Three Left Feet. My name is Jayran. I'm joined today with a few friends of mine, and we're going to read one of my personal favourite stories of all time. It's Peter and Wendy, otherwise known as Peter Pan, the boy who never grew up, following his adventures in Neverland, fighting the pirate Captain Hook, alongside the Lost Boys, his best friend, Tinker Bell the fairy, and the Darling children, George, Michael, and of course, Wendy. Today, I'll be reading chapter 3, which is when Peter and Wendy meet for the first time after Peter is caught searching for his shadow at night time in the Darling household and wakes up Wendy. So, I hope you're comfy, sit back, relax, and let's begin. For a moment after Mr. and Mrs. Darling left the house, the night lights by the beds of the three children continued to burn. They were awfully nice little night lights, and one cannot help wishing that they could have kept awake to see Peter. But Wendy's light blinked and gave such a yawn that the other two yawned also. Before they could close their mouths, all three went out. There was another light now, 1,000 times brighter than the night lights in the room, and in the time we have finished saying this, that light had been in all the drawers in the nursery, looking through Peter's shadow, rummaged the wardrobe and turned every pocket inside out. It was not really a light, but it made this light by flashing about so quickly, but when it came to rest for a second, you saw that it was actually a fairy, no longer than your hand, but still growing. It was a girl called Tinker Bell, exquisitely gowned in a skeleton leaf, cut low and square, through which her figure could be seen to the best advantage. A moment after the fairy's entrance, the window was blown open by the breathing of the little stars, and Peter dropped in. He had carried Tinker Bell part of the way, and his hand was still messy with all the fairy dust. "Tinker Bell!" he called softly, after making sure that the Darling children were fast asleep. "Tink, where are you?" She was in a jug, and for the moment liking it extremely, for she had never been in a jug before. "Oh, do come out of that jug and tell me, do you know where my shadow is?" The loveliest tinkle of golden bells answered him. This is the fairy language. You ordinary children can never hear it, but if you were to hear it, you would know that you may have heard it once before. Tink said that the shadow was in the big box. She meant the chest of drawers, and Peter jumped at the drawers, scattering their content to the floor with both hands. In a moment he had recovered his shadow, and in his delight he forgot that he had shut Tinker Bell up in the drawer. If Peter thought at all, and I don't believe he ever thought, it was that he and his shadow, when brought near each other, would join like drops of water, and when they did not, Peter was appalled. He then tried to stick it on with some soap from the bathroom, but that also failed. A shudder passed through him. He sat on the floor, and he cried. His sobs woke Wendy, and she sat up in bed. She was not alarmed to see a stranger crying on the nursery floor. She was only pleasantly surprised. "Boy," she said courteously, "why are you crying?" Peter could be exceedingly polite also, having learned the grand manner at fairy ceremonies, and he rose and bowed to her beautifully. She was much pleased, and in return bowed beautifully to him from the bed. "What's your name?" he asked. "Wendy Mortia Angela Darling," she replied with some satisfaction. "What is your name?" "Peter Pan," he replied. Wendy was already sure that he must be Peter Pan, but it did seem a comparatively short name. "Is that all?" she asked. "Yes," he said rather sharply. He felt for the first time that it was actually a very shortish name. "Oh, I'm so sorry," said Wendy. "It doesn't matter," Peter gulped. Wendy asked him where he lived. "Second to the right and straight on till morning." "What a funny address!" Peter had a sinking. For the first time, he felt that perhaps it was a funny address. "No, it isn't," he said. "I mean," Wendy said nicely, remembering that she was the hostess, "is that what they put on the letters?" Peter wished she had not mentioned letters. "Don't get any letters," he said. "But your mother gets letters?" Wendy asked. "Don't have a mother," Peter replied. Not only had he no mother, but he had not the slightest desire to have one. He thought them very overrated. Wendy, however, felt at once she was in the presence of a tragedy. "Oh, Peter, no wonder you were crying," she said, and got out of bed and ran to him. "I wasn't crying about mothers," he said. "I was crying because I can't get my shadow to stick on. Besides, I wasn't crying." "Your shadow has come off?" Wendy asked. "Yes." Then Wendy saw the shadow on the floor, and she was frightfully sorry for Peter. "How awful," she said, but she could not help smiling when she saw that he had been trying to stick on his shadow with soap. Fortunately, Wendy knew at once what to do. "It must be sewn on," she said, just a little patronizingly. "What's sewn?" he asked. "You're dreadfully ignorant." "No, I'm not." But Wendy was exulting in his ignorance. "I shall sew it on for you," she said. Though he was as tall as herself, she got out her housewife and sewed the shadow on to Peter's foot. "I dare say it will hurt a little," she warned him. "Oh, I shan't cry," said Peter, who was already of opinion that he had never cried in his life, and he clenched his teeth, and true to his word, he did not cry. Soon his shadow was behaving properly, though still a little creased. "Perhaps I should have ironed it," Wendy said thoughtfully. But Peter was indifferent to appearances, and he was now jumping about in the wildest glee. Alas, he had already forgotten that he owed his bliss to Wendy. He thought he had attached the shadow himself. Oh, the cleverness of me! It is humiliating to have to confess that this conceit of Peter was one of his most fascinating qualities. To put it with brutal frankness, there was never a cockier boy. But for the moment, Wendy was shocked. "Of course, I did nothing," she exclaimed with frightful sarcasm. You did a little," Peter said carelessly, and continued to dance. "A little," she replied. "If I am of no use, I can at least withdraw." Wendy sprang into her bed in the most dignified way and covered her face with the blankets. To induce her to look up, Peter pretended to be going away. When this failed, he sat on the end of the bed and tapped her gently with his foot. "Wendy," he said, "don't withdraw." "Wendy, I can't help it when I'm pleased with myself." Still, Wendy would not look up, though she was listening eagerly. "Wendy," he continued. "Wendy, one girl is more use than 20 boys." Now, Wendy was every inch a woman, though there were not many inches. She peeped out of the bedclothes. "Do you really think so, Peter?" "Yes, I do," he replied. I think it's perfectly sweet of you, she declared. I'll get up again. And she sat with him on the side of the bed. Wendy then said that she would like to give Peter a kiss if he liked, but Peter did not know what she meant. Therefore, he held out his hand. Oh, surely you know what a kiss is, she asked, aghast. I shall know when you give it to me, Peter replied stiffly, and not to hurt his feelings, Wendy gave him a thimble. Peter examined it. Now, he said, shall I give you a kiss? And she replied with slight primness, if you please. She made herself rather cheap by inclining her face toward him, but he merely dropped an acorn button into her hand. So she slowly returned her hand to where it had been, and she examined the acorn and thanked him. She said nicely that she would wear his kiss on the chain around her neck. It was lucky that she did put it on the chain. As for afterwards, it would save her life. And that's it for today. Thank you very much for joining us. We had a lovely time reading this story. I hope you'll join us next time for another wonderful story. And who knows, maybe when you look out your window tonight, you might see the bright, dazzling light of Tinker Bell as she flies past with Peter Pan. That's it from us. All the best. Bye-bye.